Then I'm starting this morning with the first reading that is by a poet named George Bilger. That's my best guess of how to pronounce his last name. It's called After Escher. It has nothing to do with M.C. Escher, as far as I can tell. I don't know what the title is. But I love the poem, and so this is what it says. To me, it's a poem about telling your own story and making sense of the things that we can't change in our lives. He says, 25 summers ago, I wrote a poem about the summer ending, the shadows lengthening, and the light gone soft and elegiac, like the end of a love song. It joined roughly 1 million poems written that summer alone on the same subject, but in Spanish or Japanese or Swahili. Always the same thing, same shadows lengthening, same soft light. And I ended my poem 25 years ago by saying that the back of my hand had begun to look like a dead leaf or the back of someone else's hand. And this is just a shout out to say to that version of me a quarter century ago that the hand in question looks even more like a dead leaf, even more like the back of someone else's hand. But, and this is crucial, the next observation cannot be overstated, the strange old hand is still here, still writing itself into itself. The assigned Bible reading this morning keeps us in this cycle of Genesis stories we've been talking through. It takes us right to the end of the Joseph story. Last week, we got the beginning, how his half-siblings sold the 17-year-old to some traders who were headed into Egypt. In order for this reading to make sense, we need to remember what happened after that. It's the middle of the story, of the Joseph story. Those of you who went out from here last week singing Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat songs probably can call the whole story to mind just through music. But for those who aren't that big into musical theater or who haven't read the final third of Genesis recently, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. In Egypt, Joseph was put to work in the household of an official, Potiphar, where he rose in esteem and responsibility by doing a good job, until that official's wife told a terrible lie about him and framed him because he refused to sleep with her. So then he was thrown into prison, where the head jailer also thought he was trustworthy and did a good job helping out with things that needed to be helped out with, and where he proved good at interpreting dreams. That ability came in very handy when Pharaoh started having dreams that troubled him, and Joseph was able to interpret them and to predict that there would be 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And he came up with a plan to say, well, you should save up 20% of all the grain during those 7 years, the good years, so that you can store them up and have them in those 7 bad years. And Pharaoh said, hey, that's a great idea. You're in charge. In the story's timeline, by the time those 7 years of abundance had finished, 2 years of famine had completed, Joseph was about 39 years old. He'd gone from 17 years old, sold into enslavement, to 39 years old, running Pharaoh's operations, when his brothers came to Egypt in desperate need of food. Remember, 11 brothers and a sister, and family still back there. They don't recognize him when they're led into the room to plead their case before him. And he toys with them for quite a long while. He accuses them of being spies. He puts one of them in jail and says, this one's going to stay in jail until you bring the youngest sibling back with you, because you told me about this youngest sibling. How do I trust anything that you're saying? Then he sends the rest of them home with food, but also with the money that they paid for it, which they find in their packs, and they freak out. Like, what? Oh no, first he said we're spies, now he's going to think that we're stealing from him. They convince their dad to let the youngest go back with him. And so The youngest sibling comes. Joseph meets with the whole group again, this time with the youngest sibling and the one that he's now let out of jail. They kind of make their case again. He sends them back with food again. He plants the money back in the packs, and he plants a very valuable cup in the pack of the youngest sibling, and then sends someone after them to say, this one just stole everything. So they've been terrified now. They come in to say, no, we're very sorry, we don't know what happened. And that's when today's reading picks up. So we needed to hear all of that in order for this to make sense. Genesis 45. Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, send everyone away from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his siblings. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it outside, and the whole household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brother, I'm Joseph. Is Daddy still alive? But his brothers could not answer him because they were terrified at seeing their brother. In one of the earlier stories, one of them had yelled at the others. They didn't know Joseph could understand. And he said, we're getting paid back for selling that pipsqueak into slavery. But then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. He said, I'm your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here, because God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for 2 years, and there are 5 more ahead of us. There won't be any plowing, there won't be any harvest. God sent me before you to preserve a remnant on the earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. God has made me a ruler in Pharaoh's house, lord of all his household, ruler over the land of Egypt. Hurry up and go home to Daddy and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me ruler of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You'll settle in the land of Goshen. You'll be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell Daddy how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and tell him all that you've seen. Hurry and bring him down here. Then he fell on Benjamin's neck, the youngest, and he wept on him, while Benjamin wept on his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept on them. And after this, his brothers talked with him. That's the ending of Joseph's story. Then the family comes into Egypt. That's how they get into Egypt for the later, again, very difficult stories. But this story challenges me. I don't think that everything happens for a reason. Maybe that's the place to start. At least in some circles, that's also an unpopular sentiment. There's probably a mix of opinions on that in this room and on this screen. Folks, I know, find a certain comfort in the idea that there is a guiding hand in life, even when times are tough, and one that's moving through those difficult times towards something that will ultimately be better. See, I think we can take the challenging stuff and turn it into something better. And I think that it's comforting to think that all of the stuff that I'm going through now or that I've been through is for a reason. But I've also seen that backfire in spectacular ways. Sometimes when people say it, it's not so much that they're finding comfort in the idea. It's more like they're uncomfortable in the presence of other people's grief. And so to get rid of that discomfort, they're searching around in their pockets and they pull out the thing they find stuck in the bottom under the Kleenex and the lint. And it's that sentiment. Everything happens for a reason. And that's what they pull out of the bottom of their pocket. And it doesn't really change the cancer diagnosis. Or it doesn't really take away the divorce or the lost job. To put it a different way, maybe even more bleakly, There is an absolutely heartbreaking story in the Inquirer today. Left me weeping on my breakfast. About Edwin Giovanni Lopez Cornejo, who died in ICE custody in New Jersey last week. And the story, which I really encourage you to find, we need our hearts to be broken by these things. The story is all about his daughter Ashley, and how much she just motivated him in his life from the time that she was born. It shares the social media posts, he said, from her first birthday onward. And then it talks about her and how deeply bereft she is now as a 12-year-old with her father dead from lack of adequate health care. I could never imagine looking at her and saying, well, everything happens for a reason, so we've just got to trust. His death clearly did happen for a reason, but the reason has less to do with God's will than it does with the fact that this administration is just nakedly racist and appears to enjoy cruelty. So maybe it goes without saying that I struggle with this Bible reading, because I don't think that everything happens for a reason, but I also think that people get to tell their stories. Joseph certainly has an interesting version of his own story. And I wonder if he believed it himself. Again, just to recap the recap. Last week we heard about his brothers throwing him in a pit and selling him into enslavement. Today we hear him telling those same brothers that it was God's hand and not theirs that orchestrated the whole thing. From his position of power and influence and the ability to do helpful things, there was a real logic towards that in that statement. It also helped him, that way of telling the story helped him to move towards reconciliation of these deeply broken relationships. That's powerful. Also, from the perspective of the people who wrote the story, recorded the story, it was a way for them to tell that their God, the God of Israel, was more powerful than any other competing gods. But from the human level, it feels to me sort of like a lot of hogwash. That's the term that the kids are using these days. Hogwash. No, they're not really. I don't know. That is a lot for a deity to subject a person to. Surely God could have come up with a far less traumatic way of making sure that the family was cared for in a time of famine. Besides which, if everything happens for a reason, we might reasonably ask about that famine too. Did Joseph see the hand of God at work directing things when he was in the thick of those awful circumstances? The story doesn't tell us that, and it probably can't tell us that. In the bottom of that pit, was he saying to himself, well, everything happens for a reason? As the Ishmaelites carried him off to Egypt, did he say, oh, it's okay, God's got my back? When Potiphar's wife grabbed his cloak while she was sexually harassing him and then used that to get him thrown into prison, did he say, something good will come of this? When he got thrown into the jail for behaving honorably, did he say, this is absolutely God's plan for my life? I have my doubts. It's only after he's been elevated to the position of grain manager, of immense power, of overseeing things, after he has toyed deeply with his siblings, that he looks over the whole story and says, oh yeah, God made this happen. But I think the story itself tells us that Joseph didn't feel hunky-dory about everything. That's another term that I learned from the kids these days. Would someone who truly believed that the whole thing had been God's design all along, would he have accused his brothers of spying when they showed up and didn't recognize him? Would he hold one in prison while sending the others back home and telling them they needed to bring the youngest sibling? Would he fill them with terror yet again by placing the money they'd used back in their packs and by planting something really valuable into that youngest, most beloved sibling's belongings? That all feels like revenge to me. Maybe with a bit of testing to make sure to see if they had actually changed and learned anything in the meantime. But it feels like revenge. Which is to say that the trauma had not been erased, even though things turned out well enough in the end that Joseph could tie it all up with a neat bow. God did it. In the 1800s, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who was also a Lutheran theologian, he said life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. He meant that we don't know the meaning of things while they're happening to us, but that we must discern and construct that meaning afterward. For instance, I did not know when I applied to Messiah College many years ago, which Dad, I know I'll have to tell Mom at some point. She told me that I better apply to a safety school just in case, but I never did. Mea culpa. I did not know those many years ago that when I applied to that school, it would lead to next Sunday being my 29th wedding anniversary. You like how I slipped that in there? I'll be gone next Sunday, by the way. But Priscilla will be back. But it did, and I can see that in hindsight. Joseph is doing something similar here. He's making meaning out of his past from the perspective of the present, but he's also working through the pain of betrayal at the same time. He's just not necessarily being honest about that part, maybe not even with himself. What if there is a different way of doing this than replaying our trauma under the surface of nice sentiments? What if we can learn to shape stories and to discern meaning in real time in ways that don't require us to lash out? This question comes to me from a story that I read this week and I'm still wrestling with. So the ideas are maybe not fully developed, but I'm going to share the story anyway. Sarah Schulman is an author, a playwright. She's a queer activist. She did a lot of really powerful things in the era of AIDS activism especially. And she's a professor of creative writing. In 2016, she wrote a book called Conflict is Not Abuse. And one of the events that she writes about happened to her about 10 years before that. She learned that one of her male graduate students had been keeping a blog in which he wrote about his huge crush on her. He wrote about his sexual feelings for her. He wrote about her appearance and her body in ways that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. So she talked with some colleagues about it. And what they all said to her was that he was stalking her and that she should report him. Well, if the student's blog made her feel uncomfortable, the advice of her colleagues also made her feel uncomfortable. She felt like they were all ready to rally around her and give her support if she named herself as a victim and played out that role. But it was particularly about stalking that something in her mind was saying, wait a second, because he wasn't following her around on campus. He wasn't showing up at her apartment, standing out in the courtyard with signs or anything like that. He wasn't threatening her in any way. So she didn't want to automatically torpedo his chance at a degree without at least learning more about what was going on. And so instead of following the advice of her colleagues and reporting him and making herself a victim, she decided to talk with a student and see what was going on. See if they could make some sort of meaning out of the whole situation together. It was the early 2000s. She didn't really understand what blogs were, or what people used them for, or the kinds of things that they wrote on them. So she learned that from him and figured out that part of the situation was a generational divide in how people share their feelings and process them. And she also learned that she was the first teacher who had ever taken his writing seriously, and so he was probably projecting a lot onto her based on that emotional relief. So they talked a few times. Ultimately, she helped him get assigned to a new advisor, and he was able to finish his program with no more problems for either one of them. She had given up something in that. She gave up the chance to be embraced by her colleagues, by a community that wanted to see her as a victim and support her as one. But she gained understanding and built meaning together with a young person who needed some guidance so that he could open up new possibilities. Imagine if Joseph and his brothers had been able to do that sort of thing before they threw him in the pit, or before he terrorized them in their time of vulnerability. What if they had unpacked the feelings of harm that they all held? The Joseph story is about making meaning even out of the hardest experiences in life. But what if making meaning poorly or flippantly or by resorting to slogans that we haven't thought through all the way? What if by doing that we just cover over and perpetuate the harm that's still there underneath? I think the story shows what that can look like. And it also shows a different possibility. In every single difficult turn that Joseph's life takes, the story tells us that God was with him. It does. When he's in the pit, when he's picked up and sold, every place he then prospers. God was with him. So maybe that's the truest thing that we can say, and the most important. That life is awful sometimes, in ways that are beyond our control. And I am convinced that God is not doing some kind of awful magic trick with us, dunking us in horse manure only to turn it into glitter. That's not what God does. I don't think that's how God works. I think the bottom line truth here is that whatever happens when life feels out of control, God is with us still, always, which means that nothing can separate you from the fact that you are God's beloved child. And this is ever and always God's good news. Amen.